You should see my screen now. Everything look good, Tim?
Yep, looks good.
All right, welcome everyone to my first ever Acumatica Summer Workshop Series. I'm Amy Keenan. I'm your host from the ISV Society. So excited to bring this to you to get some learning and earning CPE in as we kick off this series. And I'm so excited to have all my guests, as you can see from the logos here, who we have joining us. Wanted to go over some housekeeping before we get quick housekeeping before we get started. This is being recorded, and yes, we will be sending out an email with the recording for everybody to be able to view it at their leisure, because I know it's a long workshop. We have some great content, some in-depth content, get into the weeds with some topics. So it's even great to just go back and view it later too. And then if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section. Each section is 50 minutes. It gives us about a 10-minute buffer in between. We will try and get the questions answered for you during the session. If not, our presenters will certainly get back to you with the answers to your questions, and I'll be providing all those questions to them after the workshop. So don't worry if you don't get your question answered. And then this is our lineup for today. So as you can see, we're starting off with Tim Rodman, and then we will wrap it up with Aldrich, Avalera, and KE Commerce. So that's our lineup, but that's our time frame. Again, 10 minutes between each. So they have that little buffer in between each in case you need to take a break, get a snack. I know I will, as I will be on here the entire time. And before we do get started, I do want to launch our poll to see if anyone needs CPE today. So if you do need CPE, please feel free to take this poll right now, and we'll make sure we get you the certificates after. Usually in about a day or two, we should get those certificates to you if you do need them. So thank you for taking that. Give it a couple of seconds. All right, I don't think I have anything else to cover before we get started. So I am going to hand the reins over to Tim, who is going to take it away with SQL. So welcome, Tim, to the workshop. I appreciate you being here and excited to hear your presentation today.
Thank you, Amy. So yeah, you mentioned weeds there. We're going to start off right in the weeds pretty much. And if you see me looking up, which I will be doing, my notes are on the monitor. I'm traveling right now, so I'm coming to you from a hotel. And my notes, I didn't have access to a printer, so my notes are up on the screen. But I'm going to be doing SQL. I'm going to start off with an overview. And if you're not technical at all, I still think SQL is, well, you'll find it interesting, but we'll find out about that. And yeah, let's see. I'm curious, how good are you at SQL? Are you beginner, intermediate, advanced, or SQL? What's SQL?
We got a couple of those.
You got a couple of those? Okay. So I still think it's, for anyone who's involved with Acumatica, I think it is useful to understand what SQL is, at least. And so I'm going to start off just kind of talking about SQL, and then I will share my screen and start writing some SQL stuff. And kick back, though. This is summertime. You can kick back and relax. You don't need to take screenshots of the code or anything, because I'm going to provide all of that in the link that Amy sends out with the recording. So you don't have to, you can just copy and paste stuff if you want. So each statement that I write, you will see, you will get that. You'll get that code. And yeah, so I think that's it for the intro. And
all right, I'll let you
get
take it away.
Yeah, let's start off. So I'm not going to share my screen yet, but I just want to talk about SQL a little bit at a few bullet points to mention up on my screen here. So the first point is that SQL has been around for a long time. It was actually developed by IBM back in the 1970s. And some people say SQL. I say SQL, say whatever you want. It does stand for Structured Query Language. That's the SQL. And a lot of times you're like, an old technology, 1970s, why should I even care about this? Well, it's one of those things that has stuck around because there wasn't really a need to improve it. I remember when I was at UCLA, One of my like apartment mates was getting his PhD in computer science. And even back then, early 2000s, he was like, there's not really a lot of research to do for databases because they've just kind of figured out how to make it work. So even though it's old, it's kind of one of those proven technologies. We're still using computers that have CPUs and RAM. A lot of us are still using Windows. That's been around for decades. So there's certain technologies that just kind of stay around because they do the job just fine. And SQL is one of those things. So yeah, SQL, when I think of SQL, I think of storing data that is very structured. So SQL is a database. And every time you do something in Acumatica, every time you click that save button, it needs to save the information somewhere. And where it saves it is in a SQL database. And ERP systems like Acumatica have very structured data. You got a list of customers, list of items, etc. All that gets stored in a SQL database. And then one last point to say that it's still very relevant. So Microsoft is very good in the data space. Actually, the specific flavor of SQL that most Acumatica customers are running on is Microsoft SQL Server. So Microsoft's very good for mid-market companies, especially doing anything with data. And Microsoft, about 10 years ago, came out with a product called Power BI for reporting. Now their newest thing is called Microsoft Fabric, which is basically a way to store your data in one place without caring about what it is. Like SQL databases are good for ERP data, Acumatica data, but not so great at storing things like video files or big image files or PDFs of invoice scans. That's better stored in what they actually call NoSQL databases. But Fabric kind of brings that all together, and you don't care about how the technical stuff, you just put it all in Fabric. I bring up Fabric because it's a brand new product from Acumatica. And when Satya Nadella talked about it on stage, he's the CEO of Microsoft, he mentioned that it's probably the biggest launch of a data product for Microsoft since SQL Server in the 1990s. And what's interesting, though, is already, even though it's a brand new application, within the Fabric application, you can query your data using SQL. So it's technically a language, but it's not really like I don't think of it as a developer language, like a super computer programmer type language. It's the kind of language that was developed for business users. And I think you'll find that as you start seeing me write some SQL code. So it's technically code, but I think you'll find it's fairly easy to understand what's going on. And it's still relevant. Even the latest product from Microsoft, you can query your data using SQL. That's a core feature of the application. Okay, so I think that's it for my overview of SQL, and I think we'll just dive right in. But I wanted to give that background, and hopefully, if you didn't know what SQL was, that gets you a little more familiar. But basically, every time you hit that save button in Acumatica, the data needs to get stored somewhere. It gets stored in a SQL database. And then how do you read that data? You write SQL queries, and that's what we're going to do now. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. All right. So I'm going to be using today a little product that I had developed. I worked with I'm not a hardcore developer. I don't do real Acumatica development. I do what I call low code, no code development in Acumatica, which I consider SQL to be a low code, no code tool. And I worked with a developer to create this little product called Og SQL.
Hey, Tim, are you sharing your screen? Because I don't see it.
Thank you. I am not sharing my screen. Can you see
There
it
we
now?
go.
You should be seeing Acumatica.
I see it.
Excellent. All right, so I'm going to use, just to keep it simple, you can use something called Microsoft Management Studio. Actually, I'll go ahead and open that up just so you see what it looks like. So it's a pretty good size application, and you can write SQL this way. You can see even launching it takes a little time. Actually, it launched on my other monitors. Let me drag it over. So this is, there's a lot going on here. I'm not going to get into Microsoft Management Studio, but this is one way to write SQL. To keep it simple today, I'm going to use my OG SQL product, which you can see here. And I will include a link to this if you're interested in learning more about OG SQL and how you can get it. But it's real simple. You just put a SQL command here, we'll hit select, and then it'll show the results down below. So that's the way we keep it nice and clean. And I think I'm even gonna try zooming in a little bit more. Make this as big as possible. So let's start off with a simple SQL statement. If you think about sales orders have lines. And all the information on those lines, the quantities, the unit of measure, the items, that all get stored in a SQL table. And the SQL table, I'll just type it in. It's called SO line. But in your database, there's probably a lot of sales orders in there. So what I can do is I'm going to start with select. Select is how you start the majority of SQL statements. Today, I think it'll be all selects. But because there's so much in that table, I'm going to say top 50. I only want the first 50 records. Then next is where you would put your columns, like the columns that you want. I want the quantity, I want the item, I want the unit price, etc. But since I'm not really sure what those columns are, I'm going to put a star. The star means just get all the columns. Then we tell it from the table that we want, and we put in the table. So for sales order lines in Acumatica, it's stored in SO line. That's it. That's our first SQL statement. So hopefully that's not too scary. Hopefully we survived that. We hit select. You can see it's returning on the bottom here 50 records out of the SO line table. And if you look in the grid down here, this is just like a generic inquiry. If you've used those in Acumatica, you can click on a column and you can sort on that column or filter on that column. You can scroll to the right and see all the columns. You can see there's a lot of stuff that gets stored for each sales order line. Right now, we're looking at the first 25 records. We go to the second page. We're looking at the next 25. So just like a generic inquiry, you can page through, scroll around, and you can also hit this to download the data into Excel. So we'll just give that a second. I'll prove to you that it works. And we'll open that up. So just like with a generic inquiry, we can download it to Excel, and you see we get the same stuff. We get all the columns. I go down to the bottom here. There's 50 records with one row because of the headers. And if we scroll to the right, there's a bunch of columns in here. So that's your 2-minute tour of OG SQL. Our focus today, though, is SQL itself. So let's get back to that. So we just wrote our SQL for our first SQL statement. And again, you will have, I'll send you each one of these statements that I write with the recording that Amy sends out. So you don't need to write all this down. Kick back, relax, it's summertime. Actually, I remember one time I took, a couple times I took summer school when I was at UCLA. And one summer I took corporate tax in the summertime. And, that was not the best thing to take in the summer, but I did sit in the back and we had the window open out on the quad. So that was nice. But kick back, even though this is technical, it's summertime, take it easy. You will get the SQL snippets. But let's keep moving through here. So first thing I wanted to mention about SQL is that the code itself, it doesn't care about capitalization. So I could have wrote select, even capitalize the C if I wanted to, and it's still going to run. It doesn't care, but I like to capitalize the SQL words, the SQL commands, just so it stands out for my brain. Let's see. That's all I wanted to cover there. So moving on, when we look at the data down here, the first column you notice is called company ID. Now, company ID is important to know if you're going to write SQL statements, because if you look up here in my Acumatica instance, which is the URL that I'm using to access Acumatica, whatever.acumatica.com, usually I'm running this locally, so localhost / Acumatica 2024 R1. Within that instance, you can have multiple tenants. So I have multiple tenants. I have a sales demo tenant. I have a company 2 tenant. We call these tenants, but in the old days, for those of us old timers who have been Acumatica for a while, it used to be called company. So really this should be called tenant ID, but in the database, they just never change it. So it's called company ID. This is important because most of the time when you're querying your data, you just want the data from your production tenant that you care about. You might have some test tenants out there. So you're going to want to filter to only get back the data from the company that you care about. And we're going to do that in a minute. The second thing, that for anyone who does have multiple production tenants, it's less and less common these days because Acumatica has expanded what you can do within one tenant. But if you do, you could use SQL to query data from multiple tenants and bring it together. So keep that in mind when you're writing a SQL query. Be aware of this company ID column. It's going to tell you what tenant things are in. And if you want to see the tenants, we can run this statement here. So here, I'll type it in. Let's do an even simpler statement. We'll select all the columns from the company table, which is really the tenant table. And you can see there's the 2 tenants that we saw in the dropdown. This is like a template tenant. And I'm going to show you an example of things that get stored in there in a minute. But before I do that, I want to show you that if I go to my tenant screen, let's pop this open in a new tab. And I'm going to move at a pretty good pace going forward now. So we've introduced SQL. I want to show you as many examples as possible, knowing you're going to get the code and knowing you're going to have the recording. So kick back, take in as much as you can, and know you'll have the recording and you'll have the actual code to look back on. I'm going to create a snapshot of this tenant. I'm going to do a simple one as possible so it doesn't take too long. Let that run. And so what I want to show you is that not only is the data from each tenant stored in the same place, SO line table in our case, but also the snapshots are stored there as well. So if we come back here, we had 3 rows in here. We had our template tenant. We had our 2 real tenants. If I run this query again, we now have a 4th record with this really big negative number. And any negative company IDs, those are snapshots. However many snapshots you have, that's how many negative company IDs you have. So what actually happens when you take a snapshot is it goes through every table in the Acumatica database and it copies the data into a whole new set of data. So if you had 10,000 customers in your customer table and you take a snapshot of that tenant, you now have 20,000 customers in that table. So that's one reason why you might have heard this recommended, that you clear your snapshots out. That's one reason why. Otherwise, you're just making your database way bigger than it needs to be. But it's also good to keep in mind when you're running SQL, because you're going to see these negative company IDs. So now back to this template company ID. So what is this company ID of 1? Well, this one stores some of the standard things. Like if you've ever installed Acumatica from scratch, you'll see that it comes with some units of measure out of the box. It comes with some currencies out of the box. It comes with some, like a list of countries and provinces / states out of the box. Those all get stored in that template tenant. So if I were to query the country table and hit select here, you'll see all these records. So these are where all the countries are set up. They all have a company ID of 1 because that's where it pulls that data in when it sets up new tenants. So typically you're not going to be querying the tenant number 1 or company ID of 1, but that's why it's there in case you're wondering. All right, let's see. Now I'm going to drop a scary query on here just to show you something, but don't worry about how I came up with this. I just wanted to show that, some of the cool things you can do with SQL. I'm running on a demo database, Acumatica demo database, very clean. The only customization I have is OG SQL. And so there's a couple tables that OG SQL adds, but for the most part, it's a standard Acumatica database. And what I want to show you is that pretty much every table has company ID in there, but not all of them. But I just want to show you that it really is most of them. So I'm pasting in this scary looking query, but let's run it. And you can see that in my demo database, there's about 2,000 tables, 2017. Let's pull out my calculator. And 1,962 of those tables have a company ID column. So what is that? That is 1962 over 2017. 97% of the tables in the Acumatica database have the company ID column in there. So pretty much all the time when you're querying the database, you're going to want to include that company ID. So then the question is, how do you do that? So we started off with our select top 50 from SO line. Let's go back to that. We're only seeing company ID right here, but there's a lot more in this table. And if we wanted to make sure that we were only getting the company ID of 2, which is the sales demo tenant that I'm currently logged into, we need to filter the query. So the way you apply a filter to a SQL query is you do a where statement. And these do have to come in the right order. So you start with select, then you go to from, and then you go to where. So we're going to do where company ID equals 2. So we didn't really change the results, but now it's actually applying a filter to make sure we only get data from the tenant that we care about. But then we can do additional filtering if we want. If we wanted to, we can put as many extra things on here. And all we do is we separate it with an and. So I'm going to do and order quantity, which is a column in this table, is greater than 50. So now if I do this, let's see the data changes a little bit. And if we scroll over, let's find order ID. Order quantity. You can see that, yes, all of the order quantities are over 50 now. Okay, that's good. And let's see what I want to do next. Well, let's do another filter example. I'm going to run this one to the next line. SQL doesn't really care about line breaks, so you can, just to make it however your brain likes to read it, you can put line breaks in just to help you kind of parse through things. So I'm going to add in another and, but then in my and, I'm going to do brackets, and I'm going to say order NBR, which is the sales order number. Let's look at this 4988 sales order. So we'll say it needs to be that, or an or special word also. That's why I capitalized it. Order MBR is 3339. So what this should do is give us all sales order lines, but only from order 4988 and 3339. And their quantities need to be greater. Each individual line quantity needs to be more than 50. So we will run that. And now we can see we asked for the top 50, but there's only 12 that exist. So it only came back with 12. And we can see over here that, yes, it's 339 and 4988. And if we come back here, there they go. All these order quantities are more than 50. So we're just, You can see by this point, this might start to look kind of scary, but hopefully by stepping through it step by step, you realize the individual pieces are not that bad. And it really is a language that was designed for business users, at least based on my research and based on, what I've seen when people learn SQL. It's not some scary programming language like C#, which Acumatica, the language Acumatica is written in, is more of a robust developer language. This is just, hey, I want this from the database. I want this from the database. It's not too bad. Then I'll show you one more thing that we can do with in these filters. We can also, instead of saying it's this order number or this order number or this order number, this gets pretty redundant here because we're saying order number equals every single time if we wanted to list out a big list of sales orders that we wanted to include. Or, another thing that I've seen common, people care about a certain list of items. There's only like 10 products that they care about, and they want to see all sales order lines for those 10 products. You could do the same thing on the item column. So an easier way to write this, if we have a big list of things, we can use in. Instead of and, we'll say in. And then we don't have to repeat order number every single time. We can just say in this, we do a comma to separate them. So 4988, 3339, or 6424. I'll go ahead and run. And it looks like I forgot to tell it I needed an and in front of that in. Let's try that again. And I also forgot to tell it order number. So I do need to tell it which column. If this was going to be our item, we'd use the item column. There we go. So now there's 18 sales order lines across those 3 sales orders that have an order quantity that's greater than 50. All right, so that's like your quick overview of filtering there. Now let's move on to sorting. So, and by the way, you can put your Q&A questions in the Q&A. I'm going to get to those at the end. And Amy, I might have time for that. If I don't have time for that, I'll respond to it in the link that I send you that will have the SQL code and the recording. But go ahead and, as you're thinking of things, go ahead and drop it in there. So next, let's look at the order by. So what this is going to do, if I scroll back over here, you can see that, yes, all the sales order lines, each one has an order quantity that's more than 50, but they're not really in a meaningful order. We got 468, 505, 561. We seem to be going up, and then we go back down to 355, back up to 540. If I care about only ones that are more than 50, I might want to have them sorted by the order quantity. So we can do that by adding order by. So you can see select is how you start it, from is where you list your table, where is how you filter, order by is how you sort. And we'll do by order quantity. Let's run that again. And you can see now we've got the ones with the smallest quantity first, all the way down to the one with the largest quantity, which is this sales order line. It's got a quantity of 830. If we wanted to see that in the reverse order, we can put this DESC, which stands for descending, which is the same idea as if I were to sort here on ascending or descending, but I can write it in the SQL code. So I hit select now, and now I've got the largest order quantity on the top. Okay, let's see. Now let's come back to filtering and let's do a little bit more with filtering. So we've looked at sales order lines. Let's jump to another table now. Let's look at the B account table, which is kind of a funny name. It stands for business account, and it's where all the customers and vendors and employees and I think 1 or 2 other things get stored. They put them all in a central place. Why they did it that way, I don't really know. Well, sort of know, but it's just the way it is. I want to get everything from B account from our sales demo tenant. And because I only want customers, not those other things, I want type equals CU. And you'll see I put single quotes around things. I did that with the order numbers earlier. It's single quotes, not double quotes, just the way it is in SQL. But let's run this. So now we're looking at the B account table, and we've got a list of all of our customers. And let's say we want to do, let's do some more stuff with filtering. So let's say we only want to see customers where the name starts with the letter A. So what we do there is we do like. Oh, I need to do the name column. So account name like. And we'll do A. And it doesn't care about capitalization. So it could be uppercase A, lowercase a. It's going to find anything with an A. And then you use a percentage for a wildcard. So this is how you do starts with A. It's like, single quote, A, percentage sign means anything after A, and then another single quote. So if I run that, you'll see I now got customers that start with the letter A. Then if I wanted to do, instead of a starts with, if I wanted to do ends with, I could do this. I just put the percentage and then the A. And if I want to do a contain search, like maybe I want to find anything with LLC in the name, I just put the percentage on both sides. So it's going to look for wherever LLC is anywhere in the customer name. So I can run that. You can see in this case, it's at the very end, but it still found it. So as long as LLC is anywhere, it's just like a contain search, it will return that customer. All right, so I think that's all I had for filtering. Take a breath here. We're at about the 30-minute mark. I got about 20 minutes left. Is that right, Amy?
That is correct. And one question so far, so you're doing good.
Let's go ahead and take the question. I think let's take a little breather here and I'll
Okay.
hear the question. What
All right,
what
this
is
is
that?
from Tracy Hips. She asks, are the company IDs used with the due to, due from question mark, meaning that a company ID may be populated with the current company ID or another company ID when the second company appears as the owner of the income or the owner of the cash?
It's not, and that's what's confusing about it, and that's why I wanted to make sure I pointed it out. Yeah, what you're talking about is called company in the application. So like if I search for, there's a screen called companies, and the due to froms use companies. So what you think of or what you describe as companies in Acumatica is not the company ID. So it's the tenant. The tenant is these things. And because tenant in the old days, for those of us old timers, it used to be called company a long time ago, and they just never changed it in the database. So yeah, that's something different. That's the real company. So you just have to be aware in the database that this really should be called tenant ID, but it's not, and just know that it's called company ID.
Do you want to take the
Okay,
second
so
one or no?
sure. Is there, how many more are there?
Just one
Just
more.
one more? Oh yeah, let's go ahead. Let's take it.
She's okay. So Anne says, this is interesting, but why would we use SQL over creating GIs to get the same information?
Ah, good question. I'm going to get to that. Yeah, so
Okay.
right now, great question. So basically, when you create a generic inquiry, it's just running a SQL command for you. And actually, let me pull that up real quick, the generic inquiry screen, to show how SQL maps into that. So on the data sources, this used to be called tables, actually. This is where basically this is what you put after your from. This gets into joins, which I'm not going to get into today. It's how you join tables together, but there's join statements in SQL that you use for that. The results grid is basically your select, because what you're going to see in a minute here, that's where you list the columns that you want. If you don't want everything, which is the star. Sort order is order by in SQL. Grouping, we're going to look at a grouping example that's going to be group by in SQL, and conditions is your where clause. So it translates this into a SQL statement for you, and it's a great question. Why would you care about SQL if you can do everything you need in a generic inquiry? I'd say most of the time you can in a generic inquiry, but there are some advantages to SQL if you want to get more advanced, and I'm gonna cover that at the end. So let me get to that. All right, so rounding out kind of our staying pace with generic inquiries, let's look at how we get the columns that we want. So if we come back to our SO line example, we were telling it get the top 50 rows, but the star means get all the columns. And now we're looking at what we were looking at earlier. But what if we only want certain columns? So like order type, order number, that order quantity that we were looking at, we can list the columns instead of doing a star. So I'll do order type, comma, order NBR, order UTY. It doesn't care about the spaces. I'm just going to remove the spaces to save space. And ext price. So if I run this, we used to have a ton of columns. We had to scroll right and left to see everything. But now we only get the 4 that we asked for. So that's kind of like your results grid on a generic inquiry. And the grouping, you can also do grouping here. So we can add a group by. And right now we can see, well, hopefully we can see, do we have a good example here? Let me try. Trying to find a sales order that has multiple lines on it. Here's one. So this 7465 actually has 4 different lines on it. And what if we only want to see 1 line per sales order? So we only want to see 7465 listed once. We can do that with group by. I'm going to group by both the order type and the order number. And I'm going to get rid of these columns temporarily. And let's do that sort again, where we sort by order R. So there's 7465. Now it's only listed once. So now we've grouped so that we're only getting 1 record for each unique order type and order number combination. But now we can do what are called aggregations, which is basically, I want to count the number of lines. I want to total something up. I want to take the biggest value, or I want to take the smallest value. There's some other ones too, but those are the main 4. So I can do something like this. Maybe I want to know that for order 7465, there were 4 lines. I'm going to go to the next line just to save some space. And I could do something called count, open parentheses star, and I'll say number of lines. And there's that 7465. It used to be listed as 4 separate lines. Now it's grouped, so it's only listed once, but it is telling me that it has 4 lines on it. We could also sort by the number of lines. So maybe I want to see order by, I'm just going to copy and paste that count, and we'll do it in descending order. And now we can see the biggest sales order that we have in the system is 5491, and it has 11 lines on it. Then we can also total things up. So we did count to count the lines. We can do sum, and we'll sum the ext price, which was the dollar amount of the sales order line. And you can see I basically tell it sum the ext price, which is the dollar amount. I do a space with a single quote around it, and I give it the name of the column that I want, that I want to call it. So I can do that. So we can see that 11 line sales order the total of all the lines is $4,417. So far, we're still keeping pace with the generic inquiry, but I promise I will I will show you why SQL is still relevant. And let's see, I'll do one more. Let's also show, we'll do a max. So the max EXT price, maximum amount. And I need a comma here. After total amount, I need a comma. And so now I can see there's 11 lines on sales order 5491. The total of all those lines is $4,417. And the sales order line that is the most amount, the biggest sales order line dollar-wise is $1,000. It's a $1,250 sales order line. So I'm not going to get too crazy here, but I just wanted to show you some of the flexible things you can do. And so far, what I've done, you can do with a generic inquiry. And generic inquiries even got more powerful in the latest version of Acumatica, 2024 R1, because you can do something called subqueries in 2024 R1, which makes it even more powerful because a generic inquiry can now go off and do a subquery to say, all right, I'm looking at the number of or the list of customers that I have, but I want to go off and just go grab, I want to go look at all the AR invoices for each customer, which could be this many, this many, this many for each individual customer. And I want to total them up or count them or something and just pull that number back in. You can now do that in a generic inquiry. So why care about SQL? All right, so first, let me say that hopefully what I showed here today is that it's not too scary. I don't consider it a developer programming language. I consider it a business user programming language, a low code, not a no code, but a low code tool. It's pretty simple, at least to start off with, and you just layer things in. It might look complex when you're done with it, but each individual piece wasn't too bad. Also, with SQL, there's a ton of information out there available with SQL. There's tons of books, there's tons of blog posts. It's similar to Microsoft Excel in that what makes Excel so popular is not just the software, it's that there's so much information out there about it. So you can Google, I'm trying to do this in Excel, and you're probably going to land on a post where someone shows you how to do it. It's very similar with SQL. There's even a group of geeks that meet on Saturdays. It's called, you can go to SQL Saturday, SQLsaturday.com. And there's this whole worldwide organization about Saturday learning about SQL. So it's a very robust community, very similar to Microsoft Excel. And you can just find a ton about it. Now, let me hit this last section of why it still matters compared to generic inquiries. So even though you can now do subqueries and generic inquiries, we'll see how it plays out, but I'm pretty sure they're not going to perform as well as if you wrote the SQL query. And let me show you, let me see if I can pull up a quick example of one. When you build a generic inquiry in Acumatica, what would be a good one to look at? The AR invoices. Oh yeah, let's just do this. Let's just go to invoices and memos. And ooh, hopefully this works in my local environment. I guess we'll find out. If it doesn't, you'll just have to take my word for it. So when you run this is actually a generic inquiry here. And if you go to tools and trace, you can actually see the SQL that ran. So here's the SQL that ran. So because by default, it's only returning the top 10, the first 10 records, you can see there's that top command that we already used. So select top. They put it in parentheses. I didn't. It runs either way. Then here's all the columns that it wanted. Here's a subquery. If I keep scrolling down, there's our where clause. And so you can see a generic inquiry does generate SQL code, but you can see this one's pretty long. And I can even tell with these subqueries here that it's not always the most efficient SQL code. So if your generic inquiry is running fast enough, you're fine. If it starts getting slow, and typically I don't see generic inquiries themselves get that slow because you're only returning 10 to 20 records at a time. Where they start to get slow is when you start to use them somewhere else. Like if you use them on dashboards. If you've built out dashboards with a lot of widgets on there, you probably notice that they start to get slow. And so generic inquiries are great. I mean, they allow you to get started, get right to the data, start building things. But when you start doing things at a larger scale and you start doing more complicated calculations, and this always happens with reporting, right? Someone asks for something, you give it to them, they see it, they're like, can you also give me this? Sure. Can you also give me that? Especially when you start doing these subquery type things where you're looking somewhere, collecting information together, pulling it back and showing it, things start to get slow. And then you layer dashboards on top of it, and they just start to slow down. And you can go to a BI tool like a Power BI to speed things up dramatically. But then other people are like, well, why do I need to do that? I bought Acumatica, right? So bringing that back, why would you want to use SQL? There's two key things that you can do with SQL that you can't do in a generic inquiry. Well, I guess maybe I should say what one key thing if you use OG SQL, you can store your SQL queries in. I'm going to start with a simple one. There are two pieces. So you can store your SQL queries in something called a SQL view. And the SQL view you can think of like as being a saved SQL query. You can then connect that SQL view to what's called a data access class in Acumatica. And that you can then drop on a generic inquiry or a report, etc. Then the other thing you could do is you can save your SQL query in something called a stored procedure. And I'm going to do that part in the last few minutes. I'm going to jump to the stored procedure because I really want to hit on this question of what does it do differently than a generic inquiry. So let's just take the one that we have right here, this order type, number of lines, total amount, and I'm going to change these column names a little bit. Total amount. And we'll just call this max amount. Make sure this runs. Do a NBR of lines. Okay, so I've got this. One of the reasons things get slow is as your database gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're asking it to do more and more complicated calculations, it takes time to do those calculations on your live data. But the more complicated your calculations are, typically you don't care about live up to the minute data. If you're doing true data analysis, in my opinion, you don't need live data most of the time from what I've seen. So you have to decide. I'm going to take a hit either way, pros and cons. I'm either going to have it take longer to run and get live data, or I'm going to be happy with hourly data or data from last night. Typically, when you're looking at sales data, it's like last night's good enough. I just want to see how I'm doing for the whole year. And so I'm going to take the hit at night, and then it'll be faster to run during the day. So what you can do is, I'll do this. Let's grab all of these records. You can see there's 7,498. I can tell it my custom table. So I added this line called into my custom table. And now all that data just got stored in my custom table. So if I do a simple query, select everything from my custom table, of course, I would want to come up with a better name than that. It's got all 7,000 records in there. If I come back to this query that runs it and stores it into the table, I could wrap this. So I'm writing like what I consider to be complicated SQL, but you're going to see I don't even think it's that bad. I would need to tell it to first truncate the table, which means clear it out, and then put all the data back into it. And I can turn this into, I'm going to give it another bad name, my custom procedure. I need to put an as after this and a DBO. And again, I will send you this code in case you're interested in it. And I missed truncate table is what I wanted. Okay, so now I have a stored procedure. And what a stored procedure does is I can run a code, an execute statement that says execute that stored procedure. And, oh, okay. I will give you the correct code. I'm up against the top of the time. It's not truncate, it's something else. It's drop. But what the execute would do is it would store all the data in that table. So it does all that at night or hourly. And then if you're using AuxSQL, you could schedule that to run. And it speeds up your reports dramatically. So if you're getting slow dashboards, that's where you would then apply it. So hopefully that was a good overview of SQL. It's good to know how it works under the hood. And then in the real world, applying it, why would you use it versus a generic inquiry? It's because you can now store data you can do all those calculations at night or hourly, and then it doesn't take as long to run your reports during the day.
Yes, I learned a lot today about SQL. It's way more than I ever knew. So thank you.
We started off in the weeds. So,
we did. No, it's good. It was good. Do you want to answer this last question before you jump off, or do you want to get back to them?
Well, let's hear it. Yeah, I'll decide. Let's see what it was.
Okay. It says, maybe I don't know enough about GIs, but I will assume the GIs only select data. Knowing SQL will also allow you statements like update, delete, insert, truncate table with statements and the ability to create new objects, ?
You can. So when I just created that table and that store procedure, those are custom objects. You can also update data, although I don't recommend it or delete it because you can really destroy your Acumatica database, but it won't stop you. You can do that.
All right. Well, thank you, Tim. This was so informational, educational, all of the above. If anybody needed to start with SQL, I say they start with this and watch this recording and follow you on LinkedIn and do those SQL Saturday sessions, view those, and they want to get into the weeds with SQL too.
Look for that link tomorrow with all the snippets and
yes.
And now you know if you care about SQL further or if you've had enough.
Exactly.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Tim. All right. I did forget to mention in the beginning that we do have a worksheet that you can download. It is in the chat. I put it out there. So feel free to download it from the chat, or you will also get it in the email with the recording, and everybody that attends or registers will get an email with the recording. All right, next up, we have Nicole and Bill from Aldrich Web Solutions. Hello. How are you, Bill? I cannot hear you for some reason. You're muted. There you go.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are.
Yes. Good morning and
testing.
afternoon. Testing
1,
sounds
2.
good.
Perfect.
You sound great.